Some scars aren't visible. Mine was carved into my soul by the man who promised to love me, a millionaire who paraded my infertility as a public spectacle. Charles Howell called me incomplete and discarded me. Years later, I rebuilt my life, choosing motherhood on my own terms. Now, 8 months pregnant and radiant with hope, I walk into a hospital lobby and come face to face with him. He's not alone. On his arm is my former best friend, Megan, the woman who comforted me by day and stole my husband by night. They see my swollen belly, and in their eyes, I see not surprise, but the same old, bitter scorn. They think I'm still the broken woman they left behind. They're about to learn how wrong they are. The air in the Lenox Hill obstetrics wing always smelled the same. A sterile, antiseptic sharpness overlaid with the faint, powdery sweetness of baby lotion. For Natalie Fortney, it was the scent of hope. At 34, and just shy of 8 months pregnant, every visit was a milestone, a quiet celebration of a life she had chosen to create on her own. She rested a hand on the magnificent, taut curve of her belly, feeling the gentle flutter of the little person who was already the center of her universe. This baby wasn't a consolation prize or a happy accident. It was a declaration. She was tracing the veins on the back of her hand, waiting for her name to be called, when the automatic glass doors slid open with a soft whoosh. A wave of frigid November air swept in, carrying with it a ghost from a life she had long since buried. Charles Howell. He looked exactly the same, yet entirely different. The bespoke cashmere coat still draped perfectly over his broad shoulders, the silver at his temples was still distinguished, and his face still held the handsome, severe lines that had once made her heart ache with love. But now, seeing him, she felt nothing but the cold, smooth surface of a scar. The man who had systematically dismantled her self-worth stood less than 20 feet away, a monument to a past she had fought tooth and nail to survive. And he was not alone. Clinging to his arm, her diamond wedding ring catching the fluorescent light, was Megan Kobos, or rather, Megan Howell now. Her once best friend, the woman who had held her while she cried over her barren womb, now wore the title that was once Natalie's. Megan's gaze swept the room with the practiced nonchalance of the wealthy, and then it landed on Natalie. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then, Megan's perfectly glossed lips tightened into a smirk. She leaned in, whispering something in Charles's ear. His head snapped in Natalie's direction. The world seemed to slow down. Charles's face, a mask of bored indifference just moments before, froze. His eyes, the color of cold steel, dropped from Natalie's face to the impossible, undeniable swell of her stomach. The shock was primal, a crack in his meticulously controlled facade. For a man who prized control above all else, this was a glitch in the matrix of his universe. A universe where Natalie Fortney was a defective, discarded thing. They approached, their footsteps echoing on the polished marble. Natalie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She instinctively curled her body around her belly, a protective shield against the impending venom. "Well, well," Megan's voice was a low, syrupy poison. "Natalie, I almost didn't recognize you." Her eyes raked over Natalie's simple maternity dress and comfortable flats, a stark contrast to her own designer suit and stiletto heels. "And look at you. Who would have thought? You finally found some poor soul willing to do you a favor." The insult was designed to pierce, to remind Natalie of every cruel insinuation she had ever endured. But it was Charles's voice that shattered the air. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over her. His eyes were not on her face, but locked on her stomach with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "You're pregnant," he stated, not as a question, but as an accusation. The air crackled with the unspoken history between them, the years of invasive tests, the timed intercourse, the crushing disappointment each month, and his escalating cruelty. Natalie lifted her chin, her voice trembling only slightly. "Yes, Charles, I am." He let out a short, incredulous laugh that held no humor. It was the same sound he'd made when she'd suggested they look into his fertility for a change. "I see," he said, his voice loud enough for the other waiting patients to turn and stare. "Let me guess. You don't even know who the father is, do you?" How desperate did you have to be? The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was a public execution of her character, a replay of the private humiliations he had inflicted for years. The faces of strangers swam in her vision, their pity and curiosity a fresh layer of shame. Her cheeks burned. She could feel the familiar sting behind her eyes, the tidal wave of worthlessness threatening to pull her under. But then she felt a kick, a strong, definitive thump from within. It was an anchor in the storm. This baby was her truth. This life was her victory. The old Natalie would have shrunk, apologized, or fled in tears. The old Natalie died the day Charles filed for divorce, citing her failure as a woman. This Natalie, the one forged in the fires of that betrayal, looked him straight in the eye. A strange calm settled over her. She gave him a small, enigmatic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're right about one thing, Charles," she said, her voice clear and steady now, cutting through the lobby's hushed silence. "I don't know his name, but I know everything that matters. I know he was generous, healthy, and kind enough to give a gift with no strings attached." She paused, letting the words sink in. "He helped me create a family, which, as I recall, is more than you were ever capable of doing." The color drained from Charles's face. Megan's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of fury. For the first time in his life, Charles Howell was speechless in the face of the woman he had broken. She had taken his ultimate insult and turned it into a shield and a sword. Before either of them could retaliate, a nurse opened the door. "Natalie Fortney?" Natalie stood, her movements deliberate and graceful. She didn't give them a second glance as she walked away, leaving them standing in the sterile lobby, champions of a kingdom of two, suddenly silenced by the quiet strength of one. The first year of their marriage had been a dream spun from champagne and ambition. Natalie, then a bright-eyed 24-year-old art history graduate, had fallen for Charles Howell's relentless charm. He wasn't just handsome and wealthy, he was a force of nature, a man who spoke of building empires and legacies with such unshakable confidence that it was impossible not to be swept away. He'd courted her with the same strategic precision he applied to his business acquisitions, showering her with modern art for their sprawling Upper East Side apartment, and promising her a life of partnership and purpose. "We're going to build a dynasty, you and I," he'd murmured against her hair one night, as they stood on their terrace overlooking the glittering tapestry of Manhattan. A family to carry the Howell name into the next century. She had believed him. She had wanted it just as fiercely as he did. A home filled with the laughter of children, a warm counterpoint to the cold, calculated world of his business dealings. The dream began to fray at the edges around their second anniversary. The laughter faded, replaced by the sterile ticking of an ovulation calendar. Their lovemaking, once passionate and spontaneous, became a scheduled clinical act, dictated by temperature charts. With each passing month that ended in the quiet, crushing disappointment of her period, a subtle shift occurred in Charles. The charming partner became the exacting CEO of their fertility. "Are you sure you're tracking the dates correctly, Natalie?" he'd ask, his tone laced with an impatience that made her feel like a failing employee. "Did you avoid caffeine like Dr. Evans told you to? Maybe you're too stressed. You need to relax. It's not that hard." The blame was always, implicitly, hers. They went to the top fertility specialists in the city, men who spoke in hushed, expensive tones. Natalie subjected herself to a gauntlet of humiliating and painful procedures. Her body was poked, prodded, and analyzed until she felt less like a woman and more like a malfunctioning piece of machinery. Through it all, Charles remained aloof, a concerned spectator, waiting for the problem to be fixed. When she tearfully suggested that perhaps they should investigate his fertility, he had laughed that cold, humorless laugh. "Don't be ridiculous, Natalie. There's nothing wrong with me. The Howell men are builders. It's not in my DNA to be deficient." It was during this time that Megan became her lifeline. Megan, whom she'd known since college, was the only one who seemed to understand. She'd bring over wine and pastries, letting Natalie vent her frustrations and fears. "He's just under a lot of pressure," Megan would say, her voice a comforting balm. "He's obsessed with this idea of a legacy. Don't take it personally, Nat. He loves you. He just doesn't know how to handle this." Megan was the one who held her hand in the waiting room when Charles was stuck in a meeting. Megan was the one who encouraged her to try another round of hormones, another invasive test. "We'll get through this," she'd say, squeezing Natalie's hand. "We will." Looking back, Natalie realized Megan had never once suggested Charles was the one being unreasonable. She had always, subtly, reinforced the narrative that Natalie was the problem to be solved. The final fracture came on the night of Charles's 40th birthday gala. He had been particularly cold and distant all week, a clear sign of his displeasure after their latest fertility treatment had failed. Dressed in a stunning silver gown, Natalie tried to play the part of the adoring wife, but she felt like a fraud. Late in the evening, standing with a group of his business associates, Charles, flushed with whiskey, put his arm around her. "My beautiful wife, Natalie," he announced to the circle of men. "The most exquisite piece in my collection. A shame she's purely ornamental." The men chuckled uncomfortably. A wave of heat washed over Natalie. So intense she felt faint. It was the first time he had made his disappointment so nakedly public. She excused herself, her composure cracking, and fled to the ladies' lounge, where she locked herself in a stall and sobbed. A few minutes later there was a soft knock. "Nat, it's me." "Megan." Natalie opened the door, her face blotchy and tear-streaked. Megan pulled her into a hug. "I heard what he said. That bastard. Don't listen to him, he's drunk and cruel." She let Natalie cry on her shoulder, stroking her hair. But as Natalie's sobs subsided, Megan pulled back, her expression shifting into something more serious, almost clinical. "You know, Nat," she said softly, Maybe you need to accept that this isn't going to happen. For his sake. A man like Charles, he needs an heir. It's everything to him. Loving him means understanding what he needs, even if it hurts." The words, cloaked in concern, were a dagger. It was the first time anyone had suggested that the solution wasn't to fix her body, but to remove herself from the equation. The seed of her own obsolescence had been planted by her best friend. 2 months later, Charles served her with divorce papers. The legal language was cold, but his personal justification, delivered by his lawyer, was brutal. He saw no future in a marriage that could not produce a legacy. He called her an incomplete woman. The phrase echoed in her head for months, a brand seared into her identity. She found out about Charles and Megan 6 months after the divorce was finalized. A society gossip column ran a photo of them at a charity event, his hand resting proprietarily on the small of her back. The caption read, Millionaire Charles Howell finds happiness with longtime family friend Megan Kobos, family friend. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it hollowed her out. Every shared secret, every tearful confession, every comforting hug from Megan was retroactively poisoned. They hadn't just been moments of friendship, they had been reconnaissance. Megan hadn't been comforting a friend. She had been patiently waiting for the wounded gazelle to drop. The silence of the apartment was the loudest thing Natalie had ever heard. Charles had taken everything that mattered, the art, the designer furniture, the life they had supposedly built together. He left her with the shell, an echo chamber for his final, damning words. Incomplete woman. For 6 months, she existed in a grey fog. Depression was a heavy blanket that smothered all light and colour. She'd wake up late, the city's vibrant pulse a mockery of her own inertia. She'd stare at the blank walls where paintings used to hang, feeling just as stripped and barren. Friends from her married life, Charles's friends, really, had evaporated. The few who called offered platitudes that felt like stones. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The turning point wasn't a dramatic epiphany, but a small, mundane moment of clarity. She was standing in her kitchen, looking at a single, wilting orchid on the counter, a gift from Megan from long ago that she'd forgotten to throw out. Its petals were brown and papery, its life force gone. In that dying flower, she saw herself. And a spark of anger, the first real emotion she'd felt in months, ignited in her chest. She grabbed the pot, marched to the trash chute, and shoved it in, listening with grim satisfaction as it clattered down into the darkness. She would not wilt. She would not die on the vine. The next day, she put the apartment on the market. She sold the few expensive pieces of jewelry Charles had let her keep, trading diamonds for freedom. She moved into a small, sun-filled one-bedroom in the West Village, a neighborhood that pulsed with life and anonymity. She needed to be somewhere she wasn't Mrs. Charles Howell. Her art history degree felt like a relic from another person's life, but her experience managing the Howell family's charitable contributions gave her a skill set. She saw a job posting for a project manager at the Haven for Women, a non-profit in the Lower East Side that provided shelter, job training, and support for women escaping domestic abuse and difficult circumstances. It felt right. She wanted to be around survivors. She needed to learn their language. The work was grueling and emotionally draining, but it was real. Here, her worth wasn't measured by her fertility or her husband's name, but by her ability to write a grant proposal that could keep the lights on, or to sit with a woman who had lost everything and simply listen. She saw resilience in its rawest form. She saw women who had endured horrors she could barely imagine, yet were piecing their lives back together, stitch by painful stitch. They were not incomplete. They were warriors. Slowly, Natalie began to heal. The silence in her new apartment wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful. She filled it with books, with music, with the smell of baking bread. She was building a life that was entirely her own, on her own terms. But the desire for a child, a deep, primal ache, never left. It was no longer about fulfilling Charles's need for a legacy. It was about her own need to nurture, to love unconditionally, to create a family that was defined not by a name, but by that love. One evening, after helping a young mother at the center secure a spot in a subsidized daycare program, an idea took root. Why was she waiting for a partner? Why did motherhood have to be a duet? The women she worked with every day were rewriting the rules of their lives. Why couldn't she? The decision to pursue motherhood via a sperm donor was the most terrifying and empowering choice she had ever made. It was a quiet revolution. She spent months researching, consulting with doctors, and talking to a therapist. This wasn't a decision born of desperation, as Charles would have believed, but of profound self-awareness. She chose an anonymous donor, identified only by a number and a profile that described him as a music teacher who loved hiking and had a family history free of major illness. She didn't want to know his face or his name. He wasn't the father. He was a gift, a biological key to a door she wanted to open for herself. The process of IVF was clinical and lonely, but this time it was different. She wasn't a failure being fixed. She was an architect, building her future. She went to every appointment alone, not with a sense of lack, but with a sense of singular purpose. The day the doctor's office called with the news, Natalie was sitting on a bench in Washington Square Park, watching children chase pigeons. "Natalie?" Dr. Arden's voice was warm. "It's good news. The transfer was successful. You're pregnant." Tears streamed down Natalie's face, silent and warm. They weren't tears of relief, but of pure, unadulterated joy. She closed her eyes, placing a hand on her still flat stomach. A tiny, miraculous life had begun inside her. "Hello, little one," she whispered to the bustling sounds of the city. "It's just you and me." In that moment, she redefined everything. This baby wasn't the remnant of a failed marriage or a consolation for a life she couldn't have. This child was her choice, her beginning. This was not what was left of her life. It was the whole of it. Starting now, life settled into a rhythm of quiet joy. Natalie's days were filled with work at the Haven, where her rounding belly became a silent symbol of hope for many of the women she served. Her evenings were for herself and her baby, prenatal yoga, reading parenting books, and gently talking to the little life growing inside her. She felt more whole, more herself, than she ever had as Mrs. Charles Howell. The past was a scar, but it no longer ached. Then the invitation arrived. It came in a thick, cream-colored envelope, its weight foreboding. The return address was for the Grand Lorette Hotel, one of the most opulent and exclusive venues in the city. Her name was written in elegant calligraphy. She slit it open with a kitchen knife, a sense of dread coiling in her stomach. It was the official invitation to the Haven's annual Beacon of Hope fundraising gala. As a project manager and a key member of the fundraising committee, her attendance was mandatory. She knew this, but as she read the details, the blood drained from her face. The Haven for Women is proud to honor this year's distinguished guests and lead benefactors, Mr. Charles and Mrs. Megan Howell, for their generous contributions to the cause of building healthy families in our community. Building healthy families. The irony was so bitter, so suffocating, it felt like a physical chokehold. Charles and Megan, the architects of her life's greatest demolition, were being honored as patrons of family well-being. It was a masterful, calculated move. By aligning themselves with a beloved women's charity, they were laundering their public image, purchasing virtue. And they were doing it on her turf. Her first instinct was to refuse, to call in sick, to feign a pregnancy complication. The thought of standing in the same room with them, of watching them be celebrated while she, pregnant and alone, stood in the shadows, was more than she could bear. It felt like a trap, a meticulously designed stage for her humiliation. She took the invitation to her boss the next morning. Eleanor Vance was a no-nonsense woman in her late 60s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd been the one to hire Natalie, seeing past the society wife resume to the steel underneath. "I can't go," Natalie said, her voice tight, placing the invitation on Eleanor's cluttered desk. Eleanor read it, her expression unreadable. She looked up at Natalie, her gaze softening slightly. Because of them. It wasn't a question. Natalie nodded, her throat thick. They're the honorary guests. I'll have to interact with them. He's my ex-husband. She didn't need to elaborate on the toxicity of the split. Eleanor knew the broad strokes. And the Howell Foundation is our single largest donor this year, Eleanor stated, her voice gentle but firm. Their check is funding the new childcare wing. You know what that means for the mothers here. Natalie did. It meant women could attend job interviews without worrying. It meant their children had a safe place to learn and play while their mothers rebuilt their lives. It meant everything. Charles was using his money as both a shield and a weapon, making it impossible to escape him. He was buying his way into her sanctuary. I know, Natalie whispered, slumping into the chair opposite the desk. It just feels like a setup. Then don't let it be, Eleanor said, leaning forward. Her eyes were intense. Natalie, look at me. You are not the woman who walked in here 3 years ago. That woman was a ghost. The woman I see now is one of the strongest people I know. You are the project manager for our most successful outreach program. You are respected. You are about to become a mother. You walk into that gala with your head held high, representing everything this center stands for. Resilience, strength, and new beginnings. Eleanor's words were a bracing tonic. She was right. Running away was what the old Natalie would have done. Hiding was an admission of shame, and she had nothing to be ashamed of. This gala wasn't just a social event. It was a test. It was a collision course she could no longer avoid. You are carrying the future in you, Eleanor added softly, glancing at Natalie's belly. Don't let the past intimidate you. Natalie left Eleanor's office with a newfound resolve. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with something else, a steely determination. She wouldn't be a passive observer in their victory parade. She was an integral part of the haven. She had earned her place there. She would go not as Charles Howell's broken ex-wife, but as Natalie Fortney, a woman who was building a healthy family all on her own. That evening, she went online and bought a dress. It was a simple but elegant, deep emerald green gown, a color that symbolized rebirth. It was designed to accommodate her pregnancy, not to hide it. It was a statement. She would not be invisible. She would not be ashamed. She would walk into their spotlight and refuse to be burned. The Grand Lorette's ballroom was a symphony of excess. Crystal chandeliers, heavy as constellations, dripped light onto tables laden with towering floral arrangements and gleaming silver. The air hummed with the polite chatter of New York's philanthropic elite, a flock of beautifully dressed people accustomed to trading influence over canapes and champagne. For Natalie, it felt like stepping back into the gilded cage she had fought so hard to escape. Her emerald dress, which had felt like armor in her apartment, now felt like a spotlight. Every glance from a stranger felt weighted with knowledge of her past, though she knew it was only paranoia. She moved through the crowd with a practiced poise, nodding and smiling at board members and donors, her hand resting protectively on her belly. This child was her anchor, her silent companion in a sea of ghosts. She saw them from across the room. Charles stood at the center of an admiring circle, looking every bit the magnanimous benefactor in his tailored tuxedo. Meghan was beside him, radiant in a sequined, champagne-colored gown that clung to her slender frame. She laughed, a sparkling, theatrical sound, tilting her head back to gaze at Charles with an expression of pure adoration. It was a performance, and Natalie was the unwilling audience. For an hour she managed to avoid them, keeping to the periphery of the room, speaking with colleagues, and checking on the event logistics. But eventually, the speeches began. Eleanor gave a heartfelt introduction, thanking all the donors before turning the microphone over to the guests of honor. Charles and Meghan walked to the stage hand in hand. A hush fell over the ballroom. Charles stepped up to the podium, his face a mask of humble sincerity. "Thank you, Eleanor, for that kind introduction," he began, his voice smooth and resonant. "Meghan and I are truly humbled to be here tonight to support the incredible work that the Haven for Women does. We believe there is no greater calling than to foster the creation of strong, healthy families." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. Natalie felt his gaze pass over her, a flicker of recognition, so brief it was almost imperceptible, yet it sent a chill down her spine. "A family is the bedrock of society," he continued. "It is a legacy. It is a sacred blessing. And sadly, it is a blessing that not everyone is fortunate enough to receive. The ability to create a family, to bring a child into this world and raise them in a loving home. That is a gift, a privilege." His words were generic, philanthropic platitudes, but to Natalie they were daggers, each one dipped in the poison of their shared past. He was defining family on his own narrow, biological terms, the very terms he had used to condemn her. Then Meghan stepped forward, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. She leaned into the microphone, her smile both sweet and sharp. "My husband is, as always, too modest," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured warmth. "What he means to say is that while we have been blessed, our hearts go out to those who struggle. It is our duty, as fortunate as we are, to show compassion for those less fortunate." She paused, and her eyes, like a heat-seeking missile, found Natalie's in the crowd. "We must show compassion for those who try to build a life for themselves, no matter the circumstances, no matter the unconventional methods they might resort to." A few scattered, uncomfortable titters rippled through the tables nearest the stage. A woman at a nearby table glanced at Natalie, her expression a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The subtext was crystal clear. Meghan, without ever saying her name, had just painted Natalie as a desperate, pitiable creature, a charity case in the very room celebrating charity. The humiliation was breathtaking. It was a public stoning with words. They had taken her most private pain and her most profound joy and twisted them into a spectacle for their own amusement and self-aggrandizement. The air grew thick and heavy, and Natalie felt the walls of the grand ballroom closing in. Her hands grew cold, and for a terrifying moment she thought she might faint. The old instinct to flee, to run and hide where no one could see her cry, surged through her. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, a collective weight of judgment and speculation. They were watching, waiting for her to crack, to break down, to prove them right, to prove that she was still the fragile, broken thing Charles had discarded. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her entire body rigid. She held Meghan's gaze across the glittering room. She did not look away. She did not cry. She simply stood there, a silent, unmoving statue of green defiance amidst a sea of champagne and whispers. And in her stillness, in her refusal to crumble, she felt a shift. The shame began to recede, replaced by a slow burning, clarifying rage. They had brought the war to her. They had cornered her in her own sanctuary, and they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They had underestimated her. The applause for Charles and Meghan was thunderous. They stood on stage, a portrait of philanthropic perfection, waving graciously as they returned to their seats at the head table. The gala moved on. Waiters circulated with desserts. A string quartet began to play a Vivaldi piece, and the buzz of conversation resumed. But for Natalie, the room had been irrevocably altered. It was no longer a ballroom. It was a battlefield. She remained frozen in place for a long moment, the ghost of Megan's words clinging to her like smoke. Unconventional methods. A deliberate, venomous barb intended to strip the dignity from her choice, to frame her pregnancy as a sad consolation prize. She felt the eyes of people nearby, their furtive glances and whispered asides. They were looking at her not as a competent project manager, but as the subject of gossip, the tragic character in the Howells' triumphant story. Her first instinct was a primal scream of rage. She imagined marching up to that stage, grabbing the microphone, and telling the whole assembly of fawning sycophants the truth about Charles's cruelty, his emotional abuse, and Megan's reptilian betrayal. She imagined laying bare the hypocrisy of them championing healthy families when they had so viciously destroyed hers, but she didn't move. A voice in her head, calm and cold, cut through the emotional tempest. Don't give them the satisfaction. A public outburst was exactly what they expected. It would cast her as hysterical, unhinged. It would prove their narrative, that she was the unstable, emotional woman, and they were the graceful, tolerant benefactors. She would not play her assigned role in their twisted drama. Instead, she did the hardest thing she could possibly do. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and began to move. Not towards the exit, but deeper into the heart of the room. She forced a serene, composed smile onto her face, a mask of impenetrable calm. She walked over to a board member she knew, a kind older woman named Mrs. Albright, and began a quiet, focused conversation about the grant proposal for their new literacy program. She was aware of Charles watching her. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see him at the head table, a slight frown creasing his brow. He was expecting tears. He was waiting for her to flee. Her composure was not part of his script. It was an act of defiance more powerful than any shouted accusation. As the evening began to wind down, Natalie knew she couldn't leave without one final, deliberate act. She had to reclaim the space, to prove to herself, and to them, that she would not be intimidated. Taking a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, she made her way towards the head table. People parted for her, their conversations faltering. It felt like walking through water. Her heart pounded a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs, but her steps were even and measured. She stopped not in front of Megan, but directly in front of Charles. He looked up, startled, his mask of benign charity slipping to reveal a flash of irritation. Megan stiffened beside him, her smile freezing on her face. "Charles," Natalie said, her voice perfectly level, devoid of any pleading or anger. "Megan." She gave a slight, formal nod. "I just wanted to come over and thank you. On behalf of the Haven." Charles was momentarily thrown. "Of course, Natalie. We're happy to help. Your foundation's contribution to the new childcare wing will change lives," she continued, her eyes locked on his. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. It's so important for children to have a safe, supportive start. A foundation built on integrity. The final word hung in the air between them, shimmering with unspoken meaning. It was a perfectly polite, professional statement, yet it was loaded with the weight of everything she knew to be a lie. It was a challenge. For the first time that evening, Charles looked genuinely unnerved. In her eyes, he didn't see the weeping, broken woman he'd discarded. He saw a stranger, a cool, collected woman who met his gaze with an unnerving intensity. He saw an equal. The power dynamic, which he had so carefully controlled for years, had suddenly, inexplicably, tilted. Megan, sensing his discomfort, jumped in. Well, we're just so glad we can help those less fortunate build their little families, she said, her voice a saccharine drawl, trying to reassert their dominance. Natalie finally turned her gaze to Megan. She let a small, knowing smile touch her lips. Yes, she said softly. It's amazing what a woman can build when she's finally free of dead weight. She didn't wait for a response. She simply turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high. She could feel their stares burning into her back, a mixture of fury and confusion. As she retrieved her coat from the check room, her body began to tremble, the adrenaline finally giving way. But it wasn't a tremor of fear. It was the vibration of a string pulled taut, ready to release its arrow. They thought they had won the battle tonight. They thought they had shamed her into silence. They were wrong. They hadn't silenced her. They had given her a cause. If they want a war, she whispered to herself as the cold night air hit her face. I'll give them a war. This was no longer just about her pain. It was about the truth, and she would be the one to bring it into the light. The rage from the gala did not dissipate. Instead, it cooled and hardened into something sharp and focused. A purpose. Natalie spent the weekend in a fugue of furious thought, pacing her small apartment, her mind replaying every condescending word, every smug glance. Charles and Megan had built their gilded life on the ashes of hers, and now they were using a charity, her charity, to consecrate their union and mock her very existence. The hypocrisy was a stench she could no longer ignore. Her fight, she realized, couldn't be emotional. It had to be tactical. A public accusation would be dismissed as the ramblings of a scorned ex-wife. She needed facts. She needed proof. She needed to dismantle their pristine public image with the cold, hard reality of who they truly were. Her investigation began with a memory. A stray comment Charles had made years ago, late one night in his study. She had brought him a cup of tea, and he was hunched over financial statements from the Howell Foundation, looking annoyed. "The paperwork is the price of virtue, I suppose," he had muttered, more to himself than to her. "Move enough money through the right channels, and they call you a saint." At the time, she'd dismissed it as cynical corporate chatter. Now it sounded like a confession. She started where she could, online. She spent hours combing through the Howell Foundation's public filings, the 990 forms that detailed their grants and expenses. It was all impeccably legal on the surface. Large sums were donated to respectable causes, hospitals, universities, and of course the Haven. But as she dug deeper, she noticed a pattern. A significant portion of the administrative and consulting fees were paid out to a handful of newly formed LLCs with generic names like Strategic Philanthropic Solutions and Community Impact Partners. They had no websites, no public presence. They were ghosts. This was beyond her expertise. She needed someone on the inside. She thought back to her life with Charles, to the staff who had moved silently through their home and his office. There was one name that surfaced, Arthur Finch. Arthur had been a junior accountant at Howell Industries, a nervous, perpetually flustered man with thick glasses and a meticulous nature. Natalie had always been kind to him, remembering his children's names and asking about his wife. She remembered Charles firing him abruptly, something about a breach of protocol after Arthur had questioned an expense report. Charles had called him a small-minded bean counter. Small-minded people often remembered details. Finding Arthur wasn't easy. He was no longer in corporate accounting. She eventually tracked him down through a professional network to a small private practice in Queens, where he now prepared taxes for local businesses. She called him, her heart thudding. "Arthur, it's Natalie. Natalie Fortney, Charles Howell's ex-wife." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Mrs. Fortney, he finally said, his voice wary. It's been a long time. I know this is a strange request, she said, getting straight to the point. And I understand if you want nothing to do with this. But I have some questions about the Howell Foundation's finances. I remember you were always so thorough. He was hesitant, fearful of Charles's reach even years later. But as she explained what had happened, the public humiliation, the hypocrisy of the gala, she heard a shift in his tone. Arthur was a decent man who had been punished for his integrity. They met at a quiet coffee shop far from the city centre. Natalie laid out the public filings she'd printed, pointing to the ghost LLCs. Arthur's eyes, magnified by his glasses, scanned the pages. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. Strategic Philanthropic Solutions, he murmured, tapping a thin finger on the name. I remember that one. Mr. Howell set it up in the last year I was there. He told me it was for discreet venture philanthropy. I was instructed to process payments to it without the usual level of itemized invoicing. What did you think it was for? Natalie asked. At the time, I assumed it was for projects he didn't want public yet, Arthur said, his voice dropping. But the amounts were substantial, and the invoices were just single lines, consulting services. It felt wrong when I tried to create a more detailed paper trail. Just for our internal records, I was told to stand down. A week later, my position was eliminated. He was scared, but he was also angry. He had been professionally sidelined for doing his job. I might have something, he said, avoiding her eyes and staring into his lukewarm coffee. After I was let go, I kept a copy of my work files, a personal backup, for my own protection in case he ever tried to blame me for anything. There might be an initial wire transfer authorization, something that connects Charles directly to the creation of one of those accounts before it was buried under layers of paperwork. Hope, fierce and bright, flared in Natalie's chest. Arthur, that would be incredible. Let me look, he said, a new resolve in his voice. He built his kingdom by making people feel small. Maybe it's time a small man helped show how hollow it is. 3 days later, a cryptic email arrived from Arthur. The subject was gardening tips. Attached was a password-protected file. Inside was a scanned document, a bank transfer request from Charles's personal account to open the initial operating fund for Strategic Philanthropic Solutions. But there was more. The secondary signatory on the account wasn't Charles. It was Megan Kobos, and there was another file, a low-quality audio recording. Arthur explained he had a habit of using a small recorder for meeting notes. This one was from a brief, accidental encounter outside Charles's office. He'd bumped into Megan, who was on her phone, speaking in a hushed, angry tone. Natalie clicked play. Megan's voice, stripped of its public grace, was sharp and ugly. I don't care what the lawyers say. You move that money now. He promised me that was my safety net. My own account, separate from everything else. I won't have my future tied to his whims. If Charles goes down for this, he is not dragging me with him. Natalie listened to it 3 times. A safety net. A separate account. If Charles goes down, this wasn't just about betrayal in love. This was a conspiracy. Megan wasn't just a home wrecker. She was a co-conspirator, already planning her escape route, ready to cut Charles loose the moment the ship started to sink. Natalie now held the rot in her hands. She had the documents, she had the motive, and she had the means. All she needed was a weapon to deploy it. Evidence was one thing, exposure was another. Natalie knew she couldn't be the one to break the story. If she came forward, the media would frame it as a messy, personal vendetta, a scorned wife's revenge. The truth would be buried under a mountain of salacious headlines. She needed an objective, credible third party, a journalist with enough integrity to see the story through and enough clout to make it stick. She remembered a name from the past: Sarah Jenkins. A few years before the divorce, Jenkins, then a dogged investigative reporter for a major city newspaper, had attempted to write an exposé on Charles's predatory real estate development practices. She'd gotten close, publishing a story that hinted at shell corporations and strong-arm tactics, but she lacked a smoking gun. Charles's legal team had descended, threatening a massive lawsuit, and the newspaper, fearing the cost, had backed down. Jenkins had left the paper not long after, disillusioned with corporate media. Natalie had heard she'd gone independent, running a subscription-based investigative journalism site where she could pursue stories without editorial interference. Sarah Jenkins was a reporter who had a history with Charles and a reason to want the truth. She was the perfect ally. Natalie found her website, the Jenkins Inquiry, and sent a message through the secure contact form. She kept it brief and anonymous. I have first-hand, documented evidence of financial fraud and money laundering connected to the Howell Foundation and its benefactor, Charles Howell. This information corroborates your previous reporting. I am willing to provide it. Less than an hour later, she received a reply from an encrypted email address. Where and when? They met 2 days later in a private study room at the New York Public Library, a fortress of silence and history. Sarah Jenkins was in her 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You said you have evidence," Sarah said, opening her laptop. "Show me." Natalie's hands trembled slightly as she pulled a slim USB drive from her pocket. "Before I give you this, I need your word that my name will be kept out of it entirely. I'm not doing this for fame or revenge. I'm doing this because a women's shelter is being used as a front for a criminal enterprise." She paused. "And because the people responsible deserve to be exposed for who they really are." Sarah studied her for a long moment, her gaze assessing. "I protect my sources. Always. If what you have is real, the story will be the headline. Not you." Satisfied, Natalie handed her the drive. She watched as Sarah plugged it in, and her eyes scanned the contents. She saw the journalist's eyebrows raise at the scanned wire transfer authorization linking Charles and Meghan to the LLC. She saw her expression harden as she read the ledger of payments. But it was the audio file that made her sit bolt upright. Natalie explained the context, Arthur's accidental recording. Sarah put on a pair of headphones, closed her eyes, and listened intently to Meghan's frantic, self-serving words. "I won't have my future tied to his whims. If Charles goes down for this, he is not dragging me with him." When the recording finished, Sarah took off the headphones, a grim, satisfied smile on her face. "Well, I'll be damned," she breathed. "This is it. This is the smoking gun I needed 5 years ago. It's not just the financial trail, it's the intent. She's admitting to a criminal conspiracy and her plan to abscond." For the next hour, they mapped out a strategy. The Haven was hosting a second, smaller event in 3 weeks, a donor appreciation dinner. It was the perfect stage. "A public takedown is more effective than a quiet arrest," Sarah explained, her mind working quickly. "It prevents them from spinning the narrative. We detonate the bomb in the middle of their carefully curated world." The plan was audacious. Sarah would use the next 3 weeks to corroborate the evidence, track the money through international accounts if she could, and prepare a devastating, multi-part exposé for her site. The night of the donor dinner, just as the evening's program began, the first part of her investigation would go live. Simultaneously, she would present the core evidence at the event itself. "Are you sure you want to be there?" Sarah asked, looking at Natalie, her professional demeanor softening with a hint of concern. "It's going to be a bloodbath." Natalie thought of the humiliation she'd endured at the last gala. She thought of Charles's smug face and Megan's cruel whisper. She was the one who started this. She needed to see it through. "It's a full circle moment," Natalie said, her voice steady. "They tried to destroy me in a room just like that. It's only fitting that's where the truth comes out." Sarah nodded, a look of respect in her eyes. "All right, then let's give them a night they'll never forget." Leaving the library, Natalie felt a profound sense of lightness, as if she'd finally handed over a burden she'd been carrying for years. The truth was no longer just hers to hold. It was now a weapon in the hands of someone who knew exactly how to use it. The fuse had been lit. All she had to do now was wait for the explosion. The donor appreciation dinner was held in a more intimate, but no less luxurious, space at the Lorette, a private dining room with velvet curtains and a single magnificent chandelier that cast a warm, golden glow. The atmosphere was convivial, with about 50 of the Haven's most significant supporters in attendance. Charles and Megan Howell were, once again, the guests of honor. This time, Natalie felt no fear. As she entered the room, 9 months pregnant, and exuding a serene confidence that felt alien and wonderful, she was not an unwilling victim returning to the scene of a crime. She was a silent partner in its cleansing. She exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible nod with Sarah Jenkins, who was standing near the back, posing as a freelance journalist covering the event for a society blog. Charles and Megan were in their element, accepting compliments, their smiles as bright and hard as the diamonds Megan wore. When Megan saw Natalie, her eyes narrowed for a second, a flicker of annoyance, before she dismissed her with a slight turn of her shoulder. They still saw her as a ghost at their feast, an irrelevant footnote to their story. The evening progressed through cocktails and dinner. Natalie made small talk, her mind a placid lake on the surface, with a maelstrom of anticipation churning beneath. At precisely 8:30 p.m., as coffee was being served, her phone buzzed with a prearranged text from Sarah. "Liv, the first article had just been published. The dominoes were beginning to fall." Eleanor Vance stepped up to the small lectern to begin the evening's presentation. She gave her usual thanks, but then her tone shifted. "Tonight," she said, her voice ringing with an uncharacteristic gravity, "we have a guest who has something important to share about the nature of philanthropy and the integrity behind it. I'd like to introduce the independent investigative journalist, Sarah Jenkins." A murmur of confusion went through the room. Charles and Megan exchanged a look, their smiles faltering. This was not on the program. Sarah walked to the lectern, a tablet in her hand. She was calm, professional, and utterly commanding. "Good evening," she began. "For the past 3 weeks, I've been investigating the financial activities of the Howell Foundation. My findings, the first part of which were just published online, reveal a sophisticated scheme of money laundering and fraud, funneled through a series of shell LLCs disguised as philanthropic consultants." The room went dead silent. You could hear the clink of a fork being dropped. Charles's face turned ashen. "The funds, donated by many of you in this room in good faith, were not used to build healthy families," Sarah continued, her voice cold and clear. "They were used to inflate Mr. Howell's personal assets and to create a private offshore slush fund for his wife, Megan Howell." "This is an outrage," Charles blustered, rising to his feet. "Slander. My lawyers will be in touch." "I invite them to be," Sarah said coolly, without looking at him, "because I have the documentation, including the initial wire transfer from your personal account, Mr. Howell, and the authorization form signed by Ms. Kobos before she was even your wife." Megan's face was a mask of pure panic. She looked at Charles, then at the shocked faces around the room, her eyes darting like a trapped animal looking for an escape. "But documents can be dry," Sarah said, her voice dropping ominously. Sometimes it's better to hear things from the source. She tapped her tablet. A moment later, Megan's own voice, sharp, ugly, and terrified, filled the silent room, amplified by the venue's sound system. "I don't care what the lawyers say. You move that money now. He promised me that was my safety net. If Charles goes down for this, he's not dragging me with him." The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where a power couple's reputation had just been incinerated. Every eye in the room was on Megan, whose face had crumpled in horror. "Charles, that's not—" she stammered, turning to her husband, her hand reaching for his arm. He flinched away from her touch as if he'd been burned, his face a contortion of disbelief and utter betrayal. In one instant, he understood. She had never been his partner. She had been a parasite, preparing to detach and flee from the very beginning. As if on cue, the doors at the back of the room opened. Two men in dark suits, flanking a woman in a detective's badge, stepped inside. They walked calmly, deliberately, towards the head table. "Charles Howell," the detective said, her voice calm but authoritative. "You're under arrest on suspicion of fraud and money laundering." Chaos erupted. Megan let out a small, strangled scream, backing away from her husband as the detectives cuffed him. "I had nothing to do with this," she cried out to the room, to anyone who would listen. "It was all him. I'm a victim, too." Amidst the gasps and frantic whispers, Natalie stood near the wall, her hand resting on her belly. She didn't feel triumph or glee. She felt a profound, quiet sense of closure. She watched as Charles was led away, his imperial facade shattered, revealing the small, frightened man beneath. She watched Megan, alone and hysterical, her web of lies collapsing around her. Their empire, built on cruelty and deceit, had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. Natalie's eyes met Charles's for one final, fleeting moment as he was escorted past her. In his gaze, she saw it all, the shock, the hatred, and the devastating, final understanding. He finally saw her not as his broken discard, but as the architect of his ruin. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence, calm and whole, was the only statement that mattered. The aftermath was a media firestorm. The headlines were explosive. Millionaire philanthropist arrested in charity fraud scandal. Howell's empire of deceit. Sarah Jenkins's exposé became a viral sensation, a masterclass in investigative journalism. The story detailed every shell company, every illicit transfer, painting a damning portrait of Charles Howell's greed. Megan was not arrested, but she was destroyed in the court of public opinion. The audio recording of her betrayal was her social epitaph. Vilified as a greedy co-conspirator who had tried to play both sides, she was abandoned by the high society friends who had once flocked to her side. Within a week, she had emptied her accounts and vanished, disappearing from the New York social scene as completely as if she had never existed. The haven for women, initially reeling from the scandal, was ultimately saved by the transparency of the takedown. Donations poured in from a public outraged by the Howells' deception, more than making up for the loss of the foundation's tainted money. Eleanor made sure the narrative was clear. The haven was a victim, not a partner in the fraud. Natalie watched it all from the quiet sanctuary of her apartment, preparing for the arrival of her child. She felt strangely detached from the public drama. Her war was over. The rage had finally given way to a deep and abiding peace. 2 weeks after the gala, on a crisp, sunny autumn morning, Natalie went into labor. After 12 hours, she gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby girl, with a full head of dark hair, and eyes that seemed to hold a universe of wisdom. Holding her daughter in her arms for the first time, swaddled in a soft pink blanket, Natalie felt a love so profound it recalibrated her soul. Every painful memory, every scar left by Charles and Meghan, faded into insignificance in the face of this tiny, perfect miracle. This was her legacy. Not a name, not an empire, but this fierce, unconditional love. She named her Grace. She chose the name because, through the crucible of betrayal and loss, she had learned that self-worth was not something another person could give or take away. It was a sacred, internal state of being. She had learned to move with grace through a world that had tried to break her. And this child was the ultimate embodiment of that grace, a new beginning, born not from a void, but from a deliberate, powerful choice. "Hello, Grace," she whispered, her tears falling onto the baby's soft cheek. "It's you and me. We're going to be just fine." Her old life was a story she would one day tell, a cautionary tale about the difference between a house and a home, between a contract and a commitment. Charles had tried to write her ending, to define her as incomplete, but he had failed. Her story was just beginning. She was not the woman he had left behind in the ashes of a broken promise. She was a mother. She was a survivor. She was the woman who had single-handedly and silently brought an empire of lies to its knees. And now, she was free. The most powerful empires aren't built of money and steel, but of secrets and lies. And sometimes it only takes one person armed with the truth to bring it all crashing down. Natalie's story is a testament to the quiet strength that grows in the deepest wounds. She was told she was worthless, but she found her value. She was told she couldn't create a family, so she built one on her own terms, founded on courage and love. Her revenge wasn't loud or explosive. It was the dignified, steady act of reclaiming her own narrative and living her truth with unshakable grace. What did you think of Natalie's journey from humiliation to ultimate empowerment? Do you believe she found the perfect justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of resilience and redemption resonated with you, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories of the unbreakable human spirit.